What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we are having a look at the second semifinal game played between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, and the German Grandmaster Vincent Keymer in the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament. And of course, in day number one of the semifinals, Vincent Keymer actually beat Magnus Carlsen, and that means Magnus here is in a do-or-die situation. He has to win the game or he is out, and he is not going to the finals. Vincent Keymer will advance. Can Magnus Carlsen win the game and send the match to the tiebreaks? Let's find out. Let's dive right in. All right, in this game here, the kings are on c1 and c8, and the bishops are on g1, h1, g8, and h8. But very importantly, in contrast to earlier in the tournament, these pawns on a7 and a2 are defended, and that means f4 will not threaten to win a pawn immediately. Now here, the strongest moves for white include f4, e4, g3, and c3. In the game, one f4 was chosen by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen, and here Vincent plays very solid and plays f5 in response. Now both sides have this diagonal opened up for their bishops, but again, these pawns on a7 and a2 are more than defended, meaning neither side will win material out of the gate. Now here, white continues c3. The point being, you are opening up the attack with the queen on the pawn on f5. This is very dangerous, and here of course, if you go c6, that would be a massive blunder, as then white takes the pawn on the f5 square, but a bang, queen takes f5, and you can't take on f4 as the queen does defend. With that in mind, 2g6 is virtually forced from black. That is the only good move. Now the pawn on f5 is defended, and black has both of these diagonals opened up for those bishops on g8 and h8. Now here, white continues d4, gaining space in the center. Instead of that, e4 was a little bit stronger. The point being, if black takes, you can recapture with the queen, and the queen will not be attacked by a knight anytime soon. Instead, d4 played in the game, a solid move, and here Vincent finds a very strong move. This move really shocked me a little bit. c5, counterattacking on the center immediately. Now the point behind this move, if you take on c5, black goes but a bang, queen takes f4, winning that pawn, hitting the king on the c1 square, but a boom, and Vincent would be in the driver's seat. Now instead of that here, white goes g3, defending f4. That is the right idea, and here Vincent says, you know what, I am losing that pawn on c5. Let's trade it immediately. C takes d4 played in the game, and now here the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, has a choice. Do you recapture with the c-pawn or with the bishop? If you take with the bishop, that is actually a little bit of a mistake. Instead, c takes d4 is the right move. That is very risky, as it does open up the c-file for both of these kings. However, that is the right response. Instead, in the game, bishop takes d4 played, and of course, this does threaten to win the bishop on the h8 square. What is black going to do about it? Well, if you take on d4 with the bishop, then white takes back with the c-pawn, and white is doing excellent. Instead, in the game, Vincent Keymer, the very strong grandmaster, e5 is the move. Boom, counterattacking on the bishop immediately. And of course, if white takes on e5, black can take back with the bishop. The bishop is more than defended by the rook and the queen, and black is doing excellent. Now here, of course, f takes e5 and bishop takes are the two main responses in the game. F takes e5 was chosen, black takes back, and again, that bishop on e5 is more than defended, and black is doing just fine out of the opening. Now here, white has a few different ideas. The computer loves the idea of queen to c2. The point being, if black ever takes on d4, then you take back with the c-pawn, and you have the discovered attack on the king on c8. Instead of that, bishop g1 is also decent, and you can also play the move played in the game by Magnus, queen to d3, centralizing the queen. But I do want to point out, this move is quite a bit weaker than queen c2, according to the engine. Now here, Vincent continues with the strong move, knight c6, putting pressure on the bishop on d4, a very good move. And here already on move 7, Vincent Keymer is in the driver's seat in this game. All right, now here, what should white be doing? Well, it turns out you are not fighting for an advantage here. You simply have to take on e5, black takes back, and you have sort of a normal game, and there's still plenty of scope for Magnus Carlsen to outplay the lower-rated German grandmaster. Instead, in the game, though, bishop c5 was chosen, and this is sort of a typical Magnus Carlsen move, trying to maintain tension, trying to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, even if it's not the objectively strongest move here. However, here Vincent is ready, and he continues with the very strong idea f4. The point being, you are gaining space on the king side and putting white under a lot of pressure. Now here, Magnus, he goes knight to f2, bringing the knight off the back rank, trying to defend, and Vincent, queen to c7 is the move, getting the queen in front of the king and potentially setting up some dangerous ideas, maybe based on knight d4 or knight to b4, with the point being, if the pawn takes, the c file opens up and the queen has the attack on the king on c1. Of course, there are a lot of things that can happen before then, but that is sort of the idea. Now here, of course, Magnus has the option of long castling, a very interesting move, but instead here, he goes g takes f4, capturing that pawn on the f4 square. Now here, Vincent Keymer, of course, his bishop on e5 is under attack. You can take on f4. That is a perfectly fine move. Instead, in the game, knight to e6 was chosen, jumping up with the knight and pressuring that pawn on the f4 square. Now here, what are white's options? You can take on e5. F takes e5 is playable, but you do give up the bishop on c5 in the process. That is the idea behind knight to e6. Beyond that, you can retreat the bishop somewhere, perhaps to e3, or the square played in the game, bishop a3. Now, a3 is a very weird square for the bishop. I mean, yes, it is reasonably active on this diagonal, but it is going to be almost impossible to get it back into a different diagonal later in the game, and it's kind of out of play a little bit. All right, here, black, he takes on f4, knight takes f4, gobbling up that pawn. He equalizes the material and hits the queen on d3. Now, where is the queen going to go? It goes back to the c2 square, where it should have gone earlier in the game, where it does defend the king side. Now, here, black, again, has the option of long castling. Long castles is possible, but instead here, he goes knight to a5, a much more aggressive idea, potentially intending knight c4, putting pressure on that bishop on the a3 square. Now here, Magnus, knight to d2 is the move, defending c4 in advance, trying to clamp down on any knight c4 ideas. And here, Vincent, knight d5 is the move, dropping back with the knight yet again, trying to centralize it and trying to clog up this diagonal. Of course, that bishop on h1 has not moved at all in this game, but it is on a very active diagonal, so there's no need to move it. All right, now here, Magnus, knight g4 is the move, pressuring the bishop on the e5 square. Black retreats, bishop g7. Both of his bishops are still very active on these diagonals here. And finally, Magnus Carlsen and Vincent Keymer do castle. White castles immediately. Castling queenside is the move. Black goes knight to b6, retreating his knight. White goes b3, guarding c4. That was the idea behind knight b6, trying to gang up on that c4 square. And here Vincent does castle queenside as well. Castling queenside. And now we sort of have something resembling a normal position in chess. I mean, I'm not sure you would ever get this exact position in classical chess, but with the kings on c8 and c1, the rooks on the d and the e files, the bishops on somewhat normal-ish squares, everything is starting to make sense a little bit. All right, here, Magnus gains space in the center of the board with the move e4, a solid move. And here, black, he simply takes on c3, gobbling up that free pawn. Queen takes c3 is the move. And in case you were curious, the computer says you don't actually have to do that yet. Instead, knight to c6 may be a little bit stronger. Instead, queen takes c3 played in the game. Then we have queen takes and bishop takes, and then here e5 for the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Now, this move does give up that pawn on the e5. Now here, of course, Vincent Keymer is up a single pawn in the endgame, that being the pawn on the c-file that Vincent won with the sequence queen takes and then bishop takes, and that does give Vincent a very significant advantage in the endgame. Here he goes d5, gaining space in the center of the board, and already in the endgame, Magnus, I mean, this guy is supposed to be, like, knowing what he's doing in the endgame. Here he has a chance to get a very large advantage just with the move king to c2, driving back that bishop on the c3 square. Instead, though, he takes the pawn en passant, and this is a very serious mistake. Here, black simply goes bishop to e6, pressuring the knight on g4, and black is now equal, whereas white was having a very large advantage just on one move prior. Now here, of course, that bishop is attacking the knight. White has to defend. Rook g1 chosen in the game, supporting the knight on the g4 square. Now we have bishop to f5, clamping down on these light squares. And look at this. The king is officially out of squares it can go to. If that king comes under check, say by a knight to e2 idea later in the game, that would be checkmate. All right, now we have knight to h6. Magnus jumping up with his knight, pressuring the bishop on the f5 square. Black should go back to perhaps e6, but instead in the game, knight to c6 chosen, bringing the knight back towards the center of the board. Now we have knight takes f5, then g takes f5, and then knight to c4, jumping up with the knight. Instead though, once again, king to b1 was the right response here. Instead, knight c4 chosen in the game, giving black the option to trade on c4 and potentially damage white's pawn structure at least a little bit, and that is what the German Grandmaster goes for. Knight takes c4, then b takes c4, and then he flies in with the rook to e2, a very strong move, clamping down on this second rank, threatening both the pawns on the a2 and the h2 squares. However, Magnus still has good chances for an advantage here if he simply goes king to b1, supporting the pawn on b2 and giving up the pawn on the h2 square. Instead, rook g2 chosen in the game. This move looks very logical. Of course, it is a tactical way to defend the pawn on a2. If you take on a2, then the rook takes the rook. It is the x-ray defense of the pawn on a2. But here, black simply takes on g2, rook takes, bishop takes, and here, if he just goes king d7, he will be doing just fine. But here, Vincent Keymer gives Magnus yet another chance to press forward in the endgame. He goes bishop to b4, and this move is significantly weaker. Here, white just takes on b4, bishop takes, then knight takes, and suddenly Magnus has very good winning chances in the endgame with his bishop versus the knight in an open board with pawns on both sides of the board, and that means the bishop will be favored versus the knight in this endgame. All right, from here, a3 is the move, driving back that knight. Knight to c6 is the move, and that knight needs to find a stable home where it can exert pressure on the board. If it doesn't find a good outpost, that knight will be very, very weak. All right, white continues, bishop h3, attacking the pawn on f5 and pinning it to the king on the c8 square. There is no f4 idea as that pawn is pinned. Now we have knight to a5, jumping out with the knight, potentially intending knight takes c4. White goes bishop takes f5, hitting the king with check, not giving black time to capture that pawn on the c4 square. Now we have king to b8, the king slides over, and now here on move 32, if Magnus finds the right move in this position, he will have very good chances to win this endgame. Now, if you like, pause the video right now and try to find the key strategic idea in this position that Magnus must find. Well, it's actually not that complicated. And by the way, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. Helps me out a ton. Here, the key idea for white is simply c5. You defend that pawn on the c file. You clamp down on the pawn on d6. You prevent b6 ideas from black, because if black goes b6, you're always going to have various responses. So overall, c5 is the right way forward. But instead, Magnus Carlsen, he chokes. I don't know how else to say it. He goes bishop e6. Now, what is the problem with this move? Here, black goes b6 himself, clamping down on c5, stopping the c5 advance. And now these pawns on d6 and c4 are disconnected. There is no way to get them connected without losing a pawn. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he throws away most of his advantage in the endgame. All right, he continues, king to c2. Stronger would have been bishop, pawn to t7. Instead, king c2 chosen in the game. Now, black, knight b7. He retreats his knight. We have d7 and then king to c7. Now, white goes rook to f1, sliding his rook over. Black goes knight to c5, jumping up with the knight. Then we have bishop h3. The bishop was under attack. It simply retreats. And overall, it is looking like black will be winning that pawn on d7. And here he simply gobbles it up with the knight. Knight takes d7. Then we have rook to f7, trying to pin the knight on d7 to the king. But of course, black has that knight defended with 1-2 pieces. White only has 1-2 pieces attacking it. And therefore, black is going to be perfectly fine here. Black goes king d6, getting his king out of the pin. Then we have rook takes h7, winning that free pawn. Now Magnus is up 1 pawn all the way on the king side, but according to the engine, for whatever reason here, this is not a winning endgame. In fact, it is still dead even despite the 1 pawn advantage. Black goes knight f6, targeting the rook on the h7 square. Black goes rook to f7, returning the favor on the knight. Then we have king to e5, marching up with the king. Bishop to f1, dropping back with the bishop, and then a5, gaining space on the king side. Now we have rook to e7, targeting the king. King to d4, the king march has begun. Rook to e6, pressuring the knight. Knight g4, getting out of the attack and targeting the weak pawn on h2. White goes bishop e2, the idea being if you win that pawn on the h2 square, your knight is going to be dominated by this bishop. That is not a good idea. Whenever your knight is 3 squares away from the bishop on the horizontal or vertical files, then your knight is trapped. That is no good. So instead, instead here, knight to e3 chosen in the game, targeting the king on c2. Now we have king to b3, rook to h8, targeting the pawn on the h2 square. Rook takes b6, rook to h7, h4, and then rook takes h4. Now we have rook c6, the rook slides over, rook to h2, the rook drops back and targets the weak bishop on the e2 square. Then rook d6 targets the king, king to c5 targets the rook, rook d2, the rook flies down, and now finally we do liquidate to a relatively even endgame. Knight takes c4, winning that pawn. White goes rook c2, black goes rook h3, and here in this position, both sides do agree to a draw, and this is why the king is going to have to move. Black's going to be able to win a pawn on the h3 square if he wants it, and so on. And overall, we have liquidated to an equal endgame here. Magnus has no easy way to play for a win, and in this position, both players shake hands, and that means Magnus Carlsen does not make it to the finals of this tournament. Vincent Keymer will be advancing to the finals, and we'll have to wait and see who else makes it to the finals as well. But Magnus Carlsen, I mean, he invented freestyle chess as his pet project with his business partner, and he did not make it to the finals of the first Grand Slam of the year. That is simply amazing stuff. I don't think anyone saw this coming. I don't think anyone saw Vincent Keymer taking out the GOAT in freestyle chess, where Magnus is supposed to be, you know, simply unstoppable. So very impressive game between Magnus Carlsen and Vincent Keymer in the semifinals match of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament. If you enjoyed this video, comment down below. Let me know what you thought of the game. Smash that like button. And if you want to see more Magnus Carlsen freestyle chess action, check out this game right here where he faces off against Hans Niemann. That game was incredible. So check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.